the British...
Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these historical rewrite history. The Roaring Twenties in London's fashionable West End. After an evening playing cards, wealthy widow Lady Alice White retired to bed at the Spencer Hotel in Marylebone. But during the night, she was subjected to a brutal assault. The next morning, she was found covered in blood with a fractured skull. Her injuries were so severe, she died the next day. Police quickly launched an investigation, but with few clues, they were confronted by a baffling murder mystery. Eventually, working-class pantry boy Henry Julius Jacoby, aged just 18, was charged with the crime. Despite pleading not guilty, Jacoby was convicted of murder. And on the 7th of June 1922, Henry Jacoby became one of the youngest people to be hanged in the United Kingdom in the 20th century. Now, nearly 100 years on, Henry Jacoby's first cousin once removed, Peter, has been researching the case.
Henry Jacoby was my grandmother's nephew. As a young man, I don't think his home life was very good, so I think he spent quite a lot of time living with my grandmother. That is Henry's father. I should imagine it's probably in the late 40s. That is Rose Florence, which is my grandmother, and that's her husband, Frederick, which is my granddad.
Peter's grandparents died when he was young.
It is nice to see them, because obviously I never got the chance to know them, which is a little bit sad, really. That's Henry. What I see is a very young man. He looks like he was a nice lad. It is a bit eerie, really, knowing what happened to him. I sort of dug into the case. The more I read about it, the more I felt sorry for him, really. I don't think Henry would have got a very fair trial because of who was killed, a titled lady. Henry Jacoby was bottom of the food chain. He came from a very poor family. When he's got the establishment against him, he didn't stand much of a chance, really.
Peter would now like the case reviewed in the hope of proving it was a miscarriage of justice.
If the case did come back as unsafe, then yes, I'd be absolutely over the moon. I think Gran would have been pleased that I'm going through this process. I'd love to get a different decision from my grandmother.
The case against Henry Jacoby relied on contentious statements to the police. But was it a miscarriage of justice? And can two of today's top legal minds bring a new perspective to this near-century-old conviction? Sasha Was QC has prosecuted and defended clients in some of the UK's most notable trials. Jeremy Dean QC is a defence barrister with long-standing expertise in complex murder cases. Peter has come to London to meet the barristers.
Peter, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you, Peter. Do sit down.
Well, thank you very much for coming along to meet us. How did you first find out about Henry Jacoby's case?
It's a family meeting. Dad was actually born in Lewisham in London, but he was evacuated in the war to the south coast, and he literally didn't go back. The only time that we ever met our cousins was when they came down to visit us. That's when I found out, when we had a family reunion, about Henry.
Have you had a chance to familiarise yourself with the facts of the case?
Yes, I have. I've done quite a lot of research and read a couple of books as well.
And what's your preliminary view about whether this conviction was a true conviction, if you like?
I definitely don't think he should have been convicted for murder.
Right.
Absolutely not.
What do you think he might have been convicted of properly?
Manslaughter.
Manslaughter.
It's upstairs, downstairs justice.
A bit of class discrimination?
Oh, definitely.
All right, well, obviously, you clearly feel very passionately about it. What we'll do is we'll get on with researching all possible angles and we'll update you in the near future.
Thank you very much for coming to talk to us today.
OK, you're welcome.
Henry Julius Jacoby was born into poverty in the East End of London in 1903. He started working at the Spencer Hotel as a pantry boy just 10 days before the murder. Lady Alice White was a wealthy widow who lived at the hotel and kept cash and expensive jewellery in her room. So did Henry Jacoby kill Lady White for her money? The barristers start their investigation by examining the facts of the case.
Henry Julius Jacoby slept in the basement in the Spencer Hotel. In the early hours of the 14th of March, Jacoby called to the night porter and he described having heard whispering noises. Concerned that there were intruders inside the hotel, the two of them searched the basement. They didn't find any intruders or evidence of a break-in, so retired to bed. Later that morning, at 8 o'clock, a maid discovered Lady White bleeding profusely, very seriously injured, and obviously the subject of a sustained and violent attack. She never regained consciousness and died in the early hours of the following morning. The police investigation began immediately, and when they discovered that there was no sign of the hotel having been broken into, they suspected that someone from within the hotel might have been the attacker. Police questioned hotel staff, including Henry Jacoby. A few days later, Jacoby was charged with murder. Over a month later, on the 28th of April 1922, Henry Jacoby's trial began at the Old Bailey. The jury deliberated for only 43 minutes and Jacoby was found guilty of murder. And after a failed appeal, he was executed. So, Jeremy, what's your thoughts on this case?
Well, Sasha, the starting point for me is that Henry Jacoby made different statements to the police. And this is a feature of the case I feel strongly we need to scrutinise.
And we ought to look at whether this could properly be a case of manslaughter rather than murder.
Yeah, that's clearly vital. I'm also really interested in looking at his state of mind and how his age might have influenced circumstances of his statements to the police. It's important that we discuss all of these features with a psychologist.
Lady Alice White was born around 1858 and aged 35 married Edward White, who went on to become chairman of London County Council and receive a knighthood. After he died in 1914, she gave up their home and moved around to different hotels, settling in her room at the Spencer 2 months before she was killed. Nearly a century on, Peter has come to the hotel to learn more about the circumstances of Lady White's death. He's meeting with case expert John Eddleston.
Peter, I presume? Yes. Hi, I'm John.
Nice to meet you.
The hotel has now changed its name and undergone extensive renovations since the 1920s.
OK, Peter. Quite an impressive room.
Yeah, it is.
Not the actual room where the crime took place. That room has now been split up into more than one bedroom, so we can't see it as it was.
Right.
But it's exactly the same layout, and it's the same floor. Now, let's talk about the actual evening leading up to the attack. That night, Lady Alice White had played bridge with a few of her friends. She retired 11:30.
During the night, Lady White was subjected to a violent assault in her bedroom.
She's sleeping in this bed, which is pointing into the room this way.
Yeah.
Which means that the assailant has to come through that door and avoid the first bed.
Yeah.
Come around it and then arrive at this point.
Yeah.
The next morning, the chambermaid came into Lady White's bedroom and was confronted by a gruesome scene.
She finds that she's on the bed, blood-stained, there's blood spatter on the wall, brain tissue on the pillow. She just turns on her heels, runs down the stairs outside, screaming for help. The doctor arrives, and he says that she's beyond all aid. She dies in the early hours of the following day.
Yeah.
Lady White's stepson came to the hotel to identify her body.
At the time, he said he didn't really recognise her injuries were that bad.
All right. Her injuries must have been very severe.
And to begin with, the police are completely baffled. Nothing has been taken from the room, so what's the motive? There's no murder weapon. There are no fingerprints, apart from the ones that should be there. The investigation at this stage is wide open. It could be anybody.
Yeah. I was very surprised how gruesome it was, even to the point where one of her own relatives couldn't recognise her. I can't imagine what she went through that night. It's horrendous.
With so few clues at the crime scene, police were confronted with a challenging case. Jeremy and Sasha are piecing together information about the events on the night of the killing.
Sasha, this is a floor plan of the Spencer Hotel. Lady White, at approximately 11:30 p.m., retired to bed in room 14. The night porter let in 4 guests between 11 p.m. and 12 p.m., after which no one else entered or left the hotel. Here is the basement of the Spencer Hotel, and where the red dot lies is where Henry Jacoby slept. Now, at 1:30 a.m., Henry Jacoby went to the hall to tell the night porter that he'd heard voices in the basement. Together, they searched the basement. They didn't find anything, and so went to bed. Lady White was found dying on the next day, the 14th, and the police investigation was launched immediately. It was a whodunit type scenario.
Well, Jeremy, it's quite an interesting crime scene because it didn't look as if anyone had broken into the hotel to commit this murder. But at the same time, there were a number of suspects in terms of guests and staff.
On the question of motive, Lady White was wealthy, but in fact, no money or jewellery was stolen from her room.
This was a vicious and very violent attack. Dr. Spurgeon, who was the pathologist, spoke of 2 blows with a hammer or a hammer-like object, each of which involved considerable force. I mean, the entire left side of Lady White's head had been smashed in. On the face of it, the ferocity of the attack was out of all proportion of what would have been necessary to commit an act of theft.
Peter has come to Mayfair Library to explore some of the press coverage from the case. The killing of Lady White garnered huge public attention and sparked a high-profile investigation. With police under intense pressure to solve the crime, could this have influenced the case against Henry Jacoby?
The headline here is Dead End in the Hotel Crime. Must the murder of Lady White at the Hotel Spencer be added to the already long list of unsolved crimes? And here you've got a list which are quite a few in number. It makes me think that if they'd found anybody who was even vaguely involved with it, they were going to pounce on them and make the most of what they could. Right, this one is March 20th, 1922. The mystery of the murder of Lady White at the Spencer Hotel has taken a dramatic U-turn. Henry Jacoby, the 18-year-old pantry boy, has been formally charged with the murder. Well, I bet they can't believe they've got somebody. I think they would have used whatever means they could to get a result. He was only 18 years old and he probably wasn't that clever to get his way out of it. Whether he did it or not remains to be seen.
Before being charged with Lady White's murder, Henry Jacoby had made a series of detailed and differing statements to the police. But were his statements reliable? Jeremy and Sasha are analysing what he said.
He made 3 statements altogether. The first one was as part of the general police inquiry into all members of staff who were present in the hotel and was, broadly speaking, uninformative. He said he didn't see anything. And the second statement was made 4 days after, between 9:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. So he was being questioned for a very long period of time, and I haven't seen any evidence that he had the assistance of a solicitor and made a confession to stealing property from somebody completely unconnected with the case before he started working at the Spencer Hotel. Following that statement, on the 19th of March, Henry Jacoby confessed.
In a remarkable turning point, Jacoby made an astonishing revelation to police about his actions on the night of the murder.
He said that he had gone upstairs armed with a hammer. His intention was to steal property from one of the residents at the hotel. He went into the room and Alice White appeared to have woken up or stirred, and as a result, he hit her with the hammer, thereby causing her death.
The circumstances of the statement are questionable, and therefore its content, the reliability of that content, is the pivotal concern. That all of this, from start to finish, occurred within a framework of police investigation that doesn't even bear comparison to modern-day regulations and techniques, and in particular the long period he was held for without a solicitor having been present to advise him. And then in relation to the statement, that of course would have been tape recorded.
Of course, none of the technology existed in 1922, and the Police and Criminal Evidence Act hadn't been enacted. We've got to be careful before suggesting that in those days nothing could hold water in terms of confessions.
Well, we're dealing here with an 18-year-old. I'm really concerned that this vulnerable kid was exploited by the police and that ultimately his statement of the 19th of March is unreliable.
Well, Jeremy, I am concerned. Whether I'm prepared to go quite as far as you are in terms of the conduct of the police, I don't have that material. But I think it is something that we're going to have to weigh up. The case against Henry Jacoby depended largely on the confessions made by him to several police officers after many hours of questioning. He was 18, had no solicitor, so I think we've got to be very careful about how we look at that police confession.
Henry Jacoby was said to have had a difficult upbringing. He spent a period of time living with his aunt, Peter's grandmother. But Peter knows few details of the time he spent with her. He wants to learn more about Henry Jacoby's background and has come to East London to meet with historian of childhood, Dr. Rosie Kennedy.
Hello, Peter. So, as you know, Henry Jacoby was born around here, and at that time this was one of the poorest districts of London, very, very densely populated. We know that Henry came from a poor family. His mother had a problem with alcohol. She worked for a time as a prostitute, and this is an indication, I think, of the kind of precariousness of the family's life.
Yeah.
That there's also some suggestion that his mother would be abusive at times. So it sounds as if he had a particularly difficult childhood in his very earliest years.
Yeah,
and
stay
sadly,
with you for the rest of your life, really.
Absolutely, absolutely. And sadly, not an uncommon story for children,
Yeah.
you know, living in these difficult circumstances at the beginning of the century.
Yeah.
So we think when Henry was about 7, his parents separated, and Henry went to live with his father, who I think was your great uncle,
Yeah, yeah.
and his mother. He lives with them for a time, but then is taken in by his aunt, who I believe was your grandmother.
That's my grandmother, yeah.
Right. It sounds as if he had a really quite stable and comfortable time
Yeah.
with
Oh,
his
that's
aunt,
nice
with your
to know.
grandmother. You might like to see this. So this is a letter from the solicitors representing Henry Jacoby, and it gives some background about Henry and his life. It includes this lovely passage here about the happy time he spent living with your grandmother.
OK. Out of pity, he was taken by an aunt to live with her. Whilst in her care, he was fairly regularly attended at school and was on the way to becoming a good citizen and a useful member of society. It seemed as though he was to live down the past in a brighter future. He continued to live with his aunt on and off until he was 14 years of age. His aunt describes him as a normal boy, if somewhat reserved, and without any traces of viciousness in his nature. He was guilty of no offences and committed no crime whilst under her influence.
He goes back to live with his father and his father's new wife. You know, once he's a wage earner, he suddenly becomes valuable.
Yeah.
I think that explains why his father wants him to
Wanted him
come
back.
home.
It's a shame, really.
It looks as though those kind of peaceful years he spent with your grandmother
Yeah.
are changed again. There's certainly a suggestion that he leaves the family home and is possibly homeless for a time. You know, he's had a really very difficult life.
Although I didn't really know my grandmother, I'm very proud of what she did for Henry. She was obviously looking after him really well, and his life was really beginning to turn for the better. It's just a shame that he couldn't have stayed there longer. Things might have turned out different.
Could Henry Jacoby's difficult upbringing have impacted his state of mind and made him more vulnerable within the legal system? The barristers are meeting with psychologist Dr. Roberta Babb.
Dr. Babb, what I'd like you to do is to give us your assessment of Henry Jacoby's formative background.
His background is really quite tragic, actually. This is a man that was born into poverty, born into a very violent and aggressive household, neglects as well in the sense of often being dirty, not really being emotionally attended to. What we can say is that he had a vulnerable character as a result of his upbringing.
On the 19th of March, he made his final statement, and in the course of that statement, he essentially admitted to murder. Do you have concerns about the reliability of that ultimate confession statement?
Yes, definitely. There's so many things that we don't know. What sort of conversations he had with police outside the evidence room. In the second interview, he had 5 people present. If we think about this as a man who came from one of the lower classes, to be in that situation with so much power and authority in the room, it's got to be terrifying. I think he was even described as hysterical at one point.
And no lawyer.
Exactly. He doesn't maybe understand fully about the implications of saying things. And we know that young people have a tendency to engage in false confessions when they are tired, stressed or traumatised. He was more likely to say things and admit to things and get confused by things that he may not have done if he'd had the proper procedures followed.
Is someone who's been thrown around physically and emotionally like he had been throughout his childhood likely to be more suggestible than a confident, sort of well-looked-after young person?
Yes, most definitely.
To contemplate an 18-year-old like Henry Jacoby having to fend and defend for himself, who knows what really went on behind the scenes? No wonder he was scared witless, and that's why he confessed to murder.
Henry Jacoby's trial began at the Old Bailey on the 28th of April 1922, before the Honourable Mr. Justice McCarty. Peter wants to find out whether his relative got a fair hearing. He's come to the Viaduct Tavern, which overlooks the courthouse, to meet again with case expert John Eddleston.
Right, Peter, here we are, opposite the Old Bailey,
Yep.
where your relative, Mr. Jacoby,
Yeah.
faced his trial. At the trial, it's said that he jumped into the witness box.
Yeah.
Now, that could be for 2 reasons. One could be because he's unsophisticated and it's all a game to him. Or secondly, because finally he wants to tell the truth. He knows, perhaps, that the police browbeat him into making confessions. He now wants to tell what really happened.
At trial, Henry Jacoby pleaded not guilty and changed his account from the one he'd given to the police in his confession statement.
Do you think when he went into court that he was on a loser right from the start? He was never ever going to get away with it?
Because of the fact that he's allegedly confessed, that counts against him. He's batting on a sticky wicket straight off. Once you've signed your confession, once you've admitted it, you're going to have to be very good indeed to overturn that confession.
Yeah.
Because the police can do no wrong. Certainly in this stage, in 1922.
Yeah, we're all completely honest.
We know different now,
Yeah.
looking back.
Jacoby's account at trial was that on the night of the killing, he had left his room upon hearing voices and armed himself with a hammer. He heard sounds coming from inside Lady White's room and rushed in, then struck her, believing she was an intruder. But was this account more believable than his previous story? The barristers are continuing to discuss Jacoby's state of mind with Dr. Babb.
On objective analysis, the defence raised by him might be said to have been far-fetched. Would someone who was victim of his environmental circumstances be more susceptible to feeling vulnerable and fearful in an intruder-type situation than otherwise?
Yes, most definitely. We know when people have experienced a lot of trauma in their life, their brain actually works slightly different in the sense that if he was startled, he may have gone into a fight, flight or freeze response and fought.
But just dealing with that, all the evidence suggests Lady Alice White was in bed before Jacoby went into the room, and she was in bed when she was injured. She was a woman in her 60s. I mean, on the face of it, not a threatening situation for Jacoby. Is there any reason why he would be delusional to think that she was a threat to his immediate safety?
We know that it was dark. We know that she shrieked, and that could actually be an alarm bell in his mind, which then just totally puts him into a panic. Lady White herself, she probably wasn't a threat in her, normal, calm state. But when you put all the factors together on top of his traumatic and adverse background, it is possible that he reacted with aggression rather than withdrawing. And there's so many things around it that we don't quite know in terms of why he chose to go into the room as opposed to withdraw if he thought there was some noise or someone in there.
Thank you very much indeed for all of the issues you've discussed with us.
Thank you for
very
inviting
much.
me. Thank you.
Henry Jacoby was only 18 at the time of his trial, and his defence counsel referred to him as a boy. So how did Justice McCarty deal with potential sympathy and leniency from the jury for Jacoby's young age? John and Peter are looking at his summing up.
The judge says this youth is close upon 19 now. In the recent war, youths of 18 and 19 took their uniforms and their muskets and assumed arms for Britain. And what he's saying, in effect, is that if he's old enough to fight in a war, he's old enough to face the ultimate sanction of the law. And he carries on. Indeed, it would be a dangerous doctrine if the wives and daughters or the mothers of any citizens of this country were to be exposed to the attack of a youth of 18 or 19. He's saying you cannot let him get away with this. We should treat him as an adult, because if we don't, it may encourage other 18 and 19-year-olds to commit murder, make an example of him, in effect.
Yeah, he didn't really do him any favours.
That, I think, is bad.
At Henry Jacoby's trial, a less severe verdict of manslaughter rather than murder was open to the jury and would not entail the death sentence. Would manslaughter have been a more appropriate verdict in Henry Jacoby's case? The barristers are analysing how the judge dealt with this issue in court.
Sasha, in my view, Henry Jacoby's evidence could not have been clearer. When he was asked by his counsel, had you any intention of stealing any money? Henry Jacoby responded, no. And then critically, had you any intention of doing anybody any harm? No, sir. Had you any intention of murdering Lady White? No. And then he was asked about what he actually did, which is that he believed Lady White to be an intruder and that, in effect, he killed her by accident. And yet what the judge did in summing up was to say, even if this young man's evidence were correct, in my opinion, it would save him from a verdict of murder, but would expose him to a verdict of manslaughter.
That's wrong, isn't it? Henry Jacoby's defence was what happened was entirely accidental, and if the jury accepted that, the proper verdict in law would have been not guilty.
That is as clear a misdirection as could be.
Well, Jeremy, I've looked at the summing up and it's really littered with bias against the defendant. The judge made it quite plain he didn't believe a word of Henry Jacoby's defence. And the judge said there are two stories. Make up your mind which is the correct one. The proper approach is, are you satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the prosecution case is the correct one, not which one do you prefer? I mean, it didn't appear as if the judge has directed the jury properly, if at all, on the burden and standard of proof. This is a pretty rudimentary error.
I mean, the more we look at this summing up, Sasha, the more troubling it is, do you not think?
But I just want you to think about one thing. The foreman of the jury, before returning verdict, said this: "We desire to ask a question, my lord. The jury are all agreed that Jacoby went into the bedroom without intending to murder. But we are agreed that he intended the bedroom for the purpose of robbery. We want to be quite clear as to whether we will be justified in bringing a verdict of manslaughter on those grounds." In those days, if you committed a felony and during the course of committing that felony somebody was killed, that would be murder. The jury were all agreed that Henry Jacoby entered the bedroom for the purpose of robbery. And from that revelation, technically, Henry Jacoby would be guilty of murder given the law of the time.
We don't know what test the jury applied to that. The judge having omitted to provide the jury with a strict legal framework that he was obliged to. I don't think that any finding by this jury can be regarded as safe.
The jury found Henry Jacoby guilty of murder, and the judge passed the sentence of death. Peter has come to Pentonville Prison, where Jacoby was taken after his trial. Whilst at the prison, Jacoby learned that an appeal launched by his legal team had failed, and the Home Secretary had refused to grant a reprieve. His execution date quickly approached.
I've got The Diary of a Hangman by John Ellis, who was the executioner. I went back to Pentonville to hang a man who is still etched on my memory. Not a man, in fact, but a mere boy. He was an 18-year-old Henry Jacoby, and when I asked to see him so that I could work out the correct configuration of the scaffold, I was taken to a window. The window overlooked the exercise yard, and down there was young Jacoby. With just about 12 hours left to live, he was playing cricket as if he hadn't got a care in the world. Jacoby was laughing and chattering and enjoying himself, and I thought then that this is wrong to hang that child. He's called him a child, which is, I suppose he really was. Jacoby rose quite blithely on the morning of his execution and drank a glass of brandy, which he had asked for. A minute to 8 o'clock, the governor, standing outside the death cell, whispered to me, "Get it over, Ellis," and I went in. As I pinioned him, I said, "Look straight at me when you get there, laddie, and it will soon be over." Jacoby followed me out of the condemned cell, but then caught sight of the governor and stopped short. "I want to thank you and the officers for the kindness you have shown me," he said in a firm voice, and it is an episode that almost moved everybody to tears. I feel very sad that it came to this. It's very sad. He should never have been convicted of murder anyway. So the whole thing was totally unnecessary. It should never have happened.
With the judgment fast approaching, the barristers are examining appeals for clemency that were made on Henry Jacoby's behalf. Could their content cast any final doubt on his conviction?
It's clear that there was a real public outcry about the decision to hang young Henry Jacoby. One man, a Mr. Hewitt, even volunteered to take Henry Jacoby's place on the gallows. A very powerful letter from Henry Jacoby's solicitors, which set out in very, very clear terms the appalling abuse that Henry Jacoby had been subjected to in his years growing up. There were petitions from the Howard League for Penal Reform and other members of the public, as well as significant media coverage, and also petitions from the members of the jury who were pleading for Henry Jacoby's life. There's no doubt whatsoever that there was a strong feeling that Henry Jacoby should not be executed.
I think, Jeremy, what we've got to do is distinguish the recommendation by the jury for mercy and the verdict that they returned, because not that they appeared to be saying he wasn't guilty of murder, but just that this type of murder with this type of defendant didn't warrant the imposition of the death penalty.
Well, that's right, but I think the general drift of what people were writing and saying about Henry Jacoby was that he'd had an appalling life. Whatever he'd done on the spur of the moment, which was a phrase used in at least one of the petitions, you can't execute an 18-year-old kid.
After Henry Jacoby's execution, he was buried in the grounds of Pentonville Prison, according to the law of the time. Peter's grandmother, Rose Florence, tried to have his body returned to the family, but was unsuccessful. Peter has come to the cemetery next to the crematorium where his grandmother's ashes were scattered, in order to pay his respects. She died in 1956, when Peter was very young.
I'm just sorry that we didn't get the chance to know you or Grandad. Hopefully what we're doing now, we can find a bit of justice for Henry, and maybe we can get a different outcome and clear his name. It's nice to come to the cemetery to see where Granny's ashes were scattered, because I've never been here before. I'm really proud of what she did for Henry. I didn't realise he'd had a really awful childhood. And that when he went to stay with my gran, at least he was beginning to get back on his feet again. And she treated him like a son. So it's in her memory, really.
The barristers have completed their investigation and must now present their findings to Judge David Radford.
I feel uncomfortable with every aspect of Henry Jacoby's case. I'll be attacking police procedures, his statements, and also, frankly, the judge's summing up was appalling.
I have conflicting views about the case of Henry Jacoby. On the one hand, the account that he gave the jury was wholly incredible. On the other hand, I'm troubled by aspects of the judge's summing up.
For Peter, could today finally be the day to clear Henry Jacoby's name, nearly a century after he was convicted of murder?
Hello, Peter.
Hello.
Well, we'll be going in to see the judge quite soon. How are you feeling?
Quietly hopeful is probably the right way to put it.
Right.
I just hope for the best, really.
All right. Well, the judge has a lot of material. He's certainly very thorough. So if you'd like to follow me, we'll make our way to his room.
Yeah, OK.
With over 14 years' experience as a senior Crown Court judge, David Radford has presided over some of the UK's most infamous trials and he'll be treating this case like any other.
Please take a seat. We are here today for me to consider, with the assistance of learned counsel's submissions, the safety of the conviction of Henry Julius Jacoby. Mr. Dean.
Henry Jacoby was questioned for a long time in the presence of no less than approximately 5 police officials, no lawyer, of course, present. He then made a full confession to murder, which of course he retracted at trial. Now, it's my submission that the circumstances in which this young man was interviewed were highly unsatisfactory. Under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, this type of questioning simply would not and could not have taken place. A lawyer would have been present in the course of these interviews. There wouldn't have been a multitude of officers present. There would have been an audit trail as to what took place. None of that prevailed. In the course of this inquiry, we heard from Dr. Roberta Babb, a psychologist, who made reference to his highly volatile and vulnerable background, which would have led him to be emotionally frail and vulnerable to suggestion and intimidation. She's expressed profound concern about the reliability of Henry Jacoby's statements. It's my submission that although at the time the police had much wider discretion to conduct themselves as they wished, Your Honour should say in the circumstances that this evidence is too dangerous to have been permitted. Equally as serious is the fact that the judge failed to direct the jury in relation to Henry Jacoby's defence. Henry Jacoby denied any intent to harm or hurt anybody and went on to indicate what I in essence submit was striking out in panic and fear, bordering upon defence of property, others, if not himself. The judge failed to crystallise the defence of accident/self-defence, and in that respect, the summing up was fundamentally flawed. In those circumstances, it's my submission that this 18-year-old defendant did not receive a fair trial, and that Your Honour should say that his conviction for murder is unsafe.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Dean. What do you say, Miss Wass?
It could be said that the account given by Henry Jacoby at trial was wholly implausible. And the judge certainly made it clear to the jury that that was his view of Henry Jacoby's evidence. This approach by the trial judge to the defendant permeated the whole of the summing up. The summing up was defective because no direction whatsoever was given about the burden and standard of proof, two of the most fundamental parts of the criminal justice system. It was partial because it was repeatedly dismissive of defence submissions, and it was unhelpful because no guidance whatsoever was given as to the approach to manslaughter in this case. The judge merely said that if the jury believed Henry Jacoby's account, they should convict him of manslaughter. Of course, the matter was far more complex than that. So taking all of these matters in together, I have taken the view that the summing up was so lacking in balance that it completely undermined the safety of the conviction, and I entirely support Mr. Dean's submissions in this case.
Yes, thank you, Miss Wass. Well, I must reach my own independent conclusions, notwithstanding your joint approach. If you'll give me a time.
All right, Peter, what's your reaction?
I think everything's gone better than I could even hoped it would have done. I don't think anybody spoke up for Henry like that during his case. Otherwise, obviously, things might have been very different.
Well, just a word of warning. Just because Jeremy and I agree does not necessarily mean that the judge will agree with us.
Yeah, I understand.
Obviously, we hope he will, but it's not in the bag.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Did Henry Jacoby brutally murder Lady Alice White with a hammer in 1922? Or was he the victim of police intimidation and an unfair trial? The judge is now ready to deliver his verdict.
All accused persons, as much in 1922 as now are entitled to a fair trial and proper legal directions to the jury. Mr. Dean has made lucid and telling observations about the way in which pre-trial statements were obtained from Mr. Jacoby. Mr. Jacoby's counsel understandably made strong submissions about the fairness of admitting his client's statements. He was unsuccessful, and his submissions later to the same effect to the Court of Criminal Appeal also failed. However, the fairness of the trial was not properly fully complained of in those grounds of appeal, and the Court of Criminal Appeal seems, with respect, not to have been alert to the gross deficiencies in the summing up of the trial judge. No direction as to the burden and standard of proof was given, no proper definition as to the elements of an alternative partial guilty verdict of manslaughter was made known. The judge's presentation of the accused's own evidence from the witness box was not coherently or fairly summed up. I have no hesitation in concluding the gross unfairness and defectiveness of the judge's summing up renders, in my view, the conviction of Mr. Jacoby for murder wholly unsafe. I shall rise.
Well, Peter, you must be absolutely ecstatic at that.
I am. I'm over the moon.
I think when you reflect on today, the thought that that judge's failures could underline to have resulted in Henry being wrongly hanged is a very serious matter.
Yeah, it is, yeah, very serious, yeah. Well, if he'd been convicted of manslaughter and gone to prison and served his time, I could have met him. But obviously, it's not to be.
It's been great meeting you, and we wish you the best of luck for the future.
Thank you very much. I'm just very grateful for what you've done. I'm really pleased. As you can tell, big smile. Yeah, it couldn't have gone better. I think my grandmother would have been over the moon, absolutely over the moon.